Welcome back to Here with Goldberg. Today I'll be talking about Kaiser Wilhelm and why he matters. Now, his saga marches closely in step with the traditional Goldbergian principle that if you are a figure, especially German, with a forward looking vision for humanity, you will be maligned, castigated, and caricatured into the grave, portrayed as some mustache twirling, subhuman, demonic creature who hates the world and just wants to see death and destruction. In the case of Wilhelm, almost every biography will start with,
Well, and when he was being born, his arm got damaged, so he was insecure and he just wanted to, take over the world.
yeah, exactly. You know, Churchill was a short, fat, bald cell, and naturally he decided to burn down European civilization and the British Empire against the wishes of the monarchy, his own cabinet, the House of Commons, the British public. Most of the British figures who had lived through the First World War, and we'll talk about that later on in this video. Gandhi was an angry curry cell. That's why he stood up against the British. FDR was a cripple married to a Shaniqua, and so he became Stalin's puppet. I mean, these are fantastic. Oh, yeah, I'm a liberal conservative history buff. I love World War II. But these people are imbeciles, and they need to be treated as such. You need to have contempt for them. I emphasize that. But let's get into the story of Wilhelm, because it is quite interesting. This is his grandfather, Wilhelm I, who ruled for a number of decades in the 1800s, working closely with Otto von Bismarck, the Reich Chancellor, to basically bring modern Germany into a discernible form. Now, the German language and culture had existed for hundreds of years prior, but as far as a very specific entity, not so much. You had overlapping empires, these smaller states, you have Austria, which, although it's linguistically tied to Germany, was predominantly Catholic, and at times they were at war. Most of Germany, as far as the modern federal state, is Protestant, at least nominally, but then Bavaria was on the Catholic side. So, as Bismarck's going about this business of trying to create from the Confederation of the Rhine a functioning nation, he's seen as averse to war. It doesn't mean he doesn't engage in it at all. There was a little throwdown with Austria in the 1860s, and then in the 1870s, you have the Franco Prussian War. Bismarck did desire an additional conflict to really secure Germany's position, but he was not able to attain that, at least not under the terms that he desired. In the 1870s, and this is very key, there was an attempt at a settlement relating to Turkey. So Russia would have gained control over Constantinople. The British wanted Egypt, and there would be some other exchanges. And this was desired by Germany because it was seen as something that would essentially promote more peace. Unfortunately, it was undercut by some British people, some in the Russian government, and also Baron Holstein from the Germans. Also, Austria was not 100% on board with it, depending on who you were speaking to. In the late 1880s, Wilhelm I passes away and is succeeded by his son, who is considered to be maybe slightly on the liberal side, but that fellow lasts a few months. And Wilhelm II takes the throne as Kaiser or Emperor. At this stage, Bismarck is still in office as Reichskanzler, although he is quite old, and they don't get along. Some say it was sheer bureaucratic protocol issues, like Bismarck felt disrespected, he wasn't being deferred to enough, but there's other elements. For one, Wilhelm was a strong believer in the social monarchy or socialist monarchy concept, which is to say that the monarch, instead of being this distant, icon of tradition, would also be an interventionist on behalf of the regular people. And one of the first acts he took was to cut taxes for poorer Germans. Bismarck, despite his own legacy of introducing social reforms, actually was planning to roll much of that back and create a militaristic, traditionalist constitution dominated by not just the Kaiser, but especially the Reichskanzler. And there's the question of what they call Flottenpolitik, so it'd be naval politics. For the most part, Bismarck didn't make a big deal of asserting Germany internationally. He was content with it being a land power. Wilhelm saw this as insufficient because if you can't project your power, there's not just the military side of things, but how do you secure your economic interests? And there is foresight to this because towards the end of World War I, A blockade was put on Germany, which killed hundreds of thousands of people, civilians and soldiers alike. And then you have in 1945, 1946, you have hundreds of thousands of Germans, civilians, and POWs that starved to death under the administration of Eisenhower. And if you tell this to a liberal or conservative history buff, oh, I love World War II, they'll try to deny it and they'll use their talking points because, again, they are imbeciles. What can we do? With all that being said, Bismarck steps down. And so now it's predominantly the Kaiser calling the shots. What does he do? Well, he was a warmonger. Not quite. Despite the historical smears, Wilhelm was not some one-dimensional psychopath bent on world domination and destruction from day one, or he really wasn't at all. He understood, being a follower of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, so something of a race realist, that you need a Pax Europa. This age-old tradition of European countries, empires warring on the continent, having these bloody scats over territory, it was not sustainable. Think of the 30 Years' War. How much of the population was wiped out in that period? And so in the late 1890s, he attempts to organize a conference to disarm the continent. And that does not go over well with the UK and France, of course. Nevertheless, he's still trying to educate people about this potential threat coming from the East, Japan, maybe one day China or India. And so you have the Russo-Japanese War. The Wignats will tell you that the Care Bears were funding the Japanese, and that's true to an extent. But then they'll go into this 4D chess that the Care Bears were on both sides trying to get the Christians to fight each other later on. And the truth is, Wilhelm was sending economic support like coal for the ships of the Tsar. He wanted an alliance with the Tsar. He worked very hard towards this in many years leading up to World War I because he realized the alliance they had with Austria-Hungary. Well, Austria-Hungary was probably at best a second-rate power, not reliable, had too many internal problems. And the position of Germany, which has been a long-standing issue, Germany was situated sandwiched between, you have France on the one side, and then you have Russia that could invade from the other. So obviously they preferred to be not engaged in this two-front type conflict. It's actually interesting, on a side note, you'll hear these history buffs or ex-sperms talk about how when Mustached Man went into the Sudetenland, he left democratic Czechoslovakia just totally helpless. But they won't tell you that the post-World War I settlement, which involved all when it came to the Rhineland, right? Why did they set it up that way? Because they wanted to make it basically impossible for Germany to defend themselves from attack. So these are things that you'll see the double standards quite a great deal. At one point, Wilhelm gets from Nicholas at least a verbal agreement to an alliance, but there's some debates over whether it would include the globe as far as threats are concerned or just within Europe. So sadly, it does not advance in the direction that it should have. But nevertheless, Wilhelm still is pushing for peace, trying to draw down and de-escalate the tensions that are growing in Europe in the early stages of the 1900s. An important example of this would be the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, contrary to popular belief, he was not being killed because he was oppressing Serbs or Slavs. He was killed because he was open to power sharing and trying to get people to work together, which would have kind of reduced the overall grievances of the Serbs. So it's kind of like you see with the Care Bear conflict. They assassinate people as soon as progress is being made because they don't really want peace if you're truly a hardcore ideologue. And even when that is going forth, Austria wants to punish Serbia. Wilhelm is doing his very best to avoid overreaction. He was under the assumption that at best this was going to be a little regional skirmish. They're going to sort it out and it's going to proceed from there. He was in active communication with Tsar Nicholas, trying to prevent this from erupting on a larger scale. The main argument of Nicholas was that he would look weak if he wasn't going to back up the Serbs, who of course Orthodox Slavs. So to the extent that Pan-Slavism is a thing, he had some degree of affinity for that. Nicholas, in my opinion, as I've said before, was a good person, but he had terrible political instincts because he stayed tied to the French, which there was very few benefits from a security standpoint of being alongside the French. And culturally speaking, the French were very degenerate for a long time compared to Russia. Sadly, the conflict continues to fester, but as early as 1916, the Germans are offering a peace conference, and this is rebuffed by David Lloyd George, who was leading the campaign of Hang the Kaiser. So this atrocious event marches on. Now, to his credit, which is better than Churchill, Churchill realized he had screwed up in the mid 1940s, but at that point he was the pawn of FDR and Stalin, so there was nothing he could do. David Lloyd George, instead of just being some curmudgeonly guy and retrenching in his viewpoints, after World War One, he does a kind of truth and reconciliation. And he says there is no evidence the Kaiser wanted this war, that he was supportive of this massive conquest and destruction. He was basically dragged into it for the most part. And perhaps in part the issue is that communication wasn't quite as robust at the time, but this could have well been prevented. And that's the difference. Going back to really, we can look at the world today. If you had more David Lloyd Georges, you wouldn't have all these clowns that are so hell bent on more war, more destruction, yeah, democracy. They would realize that in the end, it doesn't lead to anything positive. But unfortunately, they're all gussied up and, oh, yeah, I'm going to be the hero. I'm going to spread democracy, when in reality, you're just spreading enslavement to the economic elites. So that's the rather tragic tale of the Kaiser, and the fact that many figures in history simply are not afforded the respect or the understanding that could have easily prevented some of these unfortunate events from unfurling.